Fraserburgh, or more commonly known as the Broch, the third largest town in Aberdeenshire. Fraserburgh sits neatly on the northern coast, right at the easterly point of the Moray Firth. Perhaps not as exposed as its close neighbour Peterhead, but it never stopped the Broch from clocking the highest wind speeds in the mainland UK. In 1989, Fraserburgh was enshrouded with gales of 142 miles an hour at sea level, making it the perfect place to get your washing dried. The town herself, once the top herring port in Britain, is still a leading whitefish and pelagic fishery today, but also holds the title of the largest shellfish port in Europe. The east coast of Scotland has always found its fortunes with the sea, and many tiny villages scatter themselves along the coast, from Gamery and Crivy, Pennin, Rosarty, Bulgar, Peterhead, Bodham and the rest. But it was Fraserburgh who would fight tooth and nail to become the premier herring port through the 1850s to the early 90s. From a humbling 47,000 barrels of herring landed in 1851 to the bumper year of 1907, whereby 517,000 barrels was produced. An industry and local economy which would support a nation of families and provide employment from the gutting Quines, the curers, the coopers, the divers, the architects and the engineers, the shipbuilders, the fishermen and their wives. An industry which raised the simple villages of Faithley and Broadsea under the guidance and patronage of the Fraser lineage into a town boasting now some of the largest and most advanced fishing ships in the North Sea. A feat that many a brocher takes for granted. But trust me, boats dinna look like this anywhere else, and it should be appreciated that as an island nation, the United Kingdom is surrounded by sea, and fishing communities are found up and down the coast. But it is between Fraserburgh and Peterhead, these two northeastern titans, that make up 85% of the UK's catch. Our links to the sea, our fishing heritage should spark a pride in us, and we should be proud that Fraserburgh has succeeded where so many others have failed. And history will tell us it was not an easy task, and so on many occasions it came right down to the wire. Get that pier built, get those boats in, for politicians, lords, gentry and the great engineers of the past have graced the harbours and furthered their cause to secure more berths, larger berths, deeper berths, from the time of the sail and wooden rudder through the advancement of the steam drifter unto the diesel trawler and beyond. Fraserburgh and her inhabitants have been there to embrace the opportunity for success, and with two hands have grabbed it tightly and reaped the rewards. Nobody said it would be easy. The good times have come with the bad. The silver darling is an elusive creature at times, and hardships have been felt by many. Storms have crumbled breakwaters, boats have sunken, and many lives have been lost. One of the most dangerous professions in the world, where still today the northeastern man tends his trade for the good old fish supper. Fraserburgh consumed the little-known Faithley village, the settlement which would eventually provide the foundations for the great harbour itself. But further west, there too was another settlement. Although today its boundaries with the Broch, which once formed open fields, have been swallowed up by the town's growth, yet Broadsea, or the Broadsea, still preserves an identity of its own. Sometimes simply referred to as the Sea Town, old Button Ben cottages, though modernised, they still hold that old toon feel about them. The fishermen's cottages. You can imagine the nets drying, the small lines being baited at the door, and the smoking o' the lum. Traditionally, these older houses were built of sea rock and stones gathered from the nearby shores. The roofs were thatched with either heather, broom or straw, but sometimes only earthy divots covered the roof. Normally, there would have been one window per room, but they would be small, in fact only sufficient to allow light into the house. Often there was no glass in the early homes, which had strong wooden shutters to cover the opening in the evening. Inside was also whitewashed to increase the light. The floors would have been earthen and sprinkled with sand or gravel, which was changed as it became dirty, and one such earthen-floored house still exists in Inverallie and still goes by the name of Maggie's Hoosie. At the Broadsea, most hooses looked on to the bay, where the small ships would be hauled up under the shore, and in 1629 Broadsea had 3 boats, and in 1789 there were 48 fishermen and 7 boats. This is a time long forgotten. Folk didn't hae much, but what they did have, they looked after. They shared and they cared. The close-knit communities back then, they kent Aberdeen and Athen that was gone on, and it is something that was written about extensively in the Christian Watt papers, which was a book published with an incredibly insight into the 18th century Broadsea. And if you're interested, read it, but it paints the picture of these old stone hoosies, soot black with the fires burning in the central room, with beds pitted at the corners. Generations of family living under the same roof, and Abdi to work, again as a servant to the gentry, out tying nets, walking for miles from firm to firm with a cran of herring for selling, and perhaps returning with a yoke of milk on your shoulders in exchange. There was a pride there too. Your living conditions might have been basic, but Athen was always kept clean and proper. Working clays for 6 days, and the Sunday best for a day at the kirk. And those less fortunate, those tinkers and travellers, would be invited in for a meal and a warm place to sleep. A true community. They didn't hae nothing, but they didn't ken any better. Lord Pitsligo himsel even slept a night in the Broadsea, hiding for the Hanoverian troops in the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden. In the days of the herring boom, larger sail-powered drifters were launched from the Broadsea shore below the hooses, and traction engines were brought in to drag these heavier craft across the pebbled beach. But out in the bay, the Broadsea hole was described as a favourite haunt for herring, so much so that on the 29th of August 1916, shoals of silver darlings were trapped amongst the rock pools as the tide receded. All you had to do yon day was go down and help yourself, and the local collector of Jews must have fair exceeded his quota that day. The village, for its part, has provided a good stock of fishermen and heroes for the Royal Navy Reserves in World War I, the most notable being Joe Watt, known as VC Joe, the first fisherman to be awarded the Victoria Cross. He was a native of Gardenston who was born into a fishing family, but unfortunately when Joe was only 10 years old, his father was lost at sea in an accident. The family then moved to Broadsea. His mum remarried. He'd learned the fishing trade aboard the White Daisy before purchasing a stake in the drifter Annie. When the war came, most men volunteered for the service, patrolling, hunting for enemy shipping, submarines, and many fishing vessels being repurposed for the job. Joe was no exception. On the 15th of May 1917, Skipper Watt and his crew of 8, plus a dog, were patrolling the Otranto Strait. Joe's ship, the Gowan Lee, was confronted by the SMS Helgoland, a Navara-class scout cruiser, which demanded the surrender of the tiny drifter, ordering the crew to abandon ship. Instead, Watt ordered his crew to open fire on their opponent. Gowan Lee was quickly hit by 4 heavy shells, seriously damaging the boat and wounding several crewmen. Other drifters in the surrounding area, she followed her example, but they were also subject to heavy fire. Eventually, the Austrian cruiser headed for home, but on its return, it was engaged by the British, Italian and French units. For Watt, his injured crew and the battered Gowan Lee, even despite their own heavy damage, they moved across the wreckage and rescued many wounded men, providing medical attention to those most in need. In particular, Watt saved the wounded crew of the sinking drifter Floandi, who may have otherwise drowned. But Watt was the only recipient of the award from the men put forward, and upon his return to Fraserburgh, he refused point blank to ever speak of his war experience again. His boat, Annie, had been lost at war to a sea mine, so he bought the Benehi as a replacement, on board which he once forgot to remove his cap on meeting the Duke of Kent, an omission which mortified him for years afterwards. But Watt, he was always shunned the fame generated by his award, and he actually kept the Victoria Cross medal in a drawer full of junk on board his boat. Fraserburgh, in the modern port of today, is the result of several hundred years of growth, as well as some quite remarkable feats of engineering. But for as long as there has been folk on these shores, they have worked the sea. Fish were plentiful all along the inshore waters. You didn't hate to stray far from land with a tiny line boat to gain and catch cod, mackerel, herring, and there was plenty of places in which your ship could be beached safely in the many hidden coves and dramatic seascapes of the northeast of Scotland. But these landing spots could only last so long. As industry evolves, so do the sizes of these vessels. Natural harbours were soon no longer suitable, and other ports were beginning to see new prosperity in the expansion of their harbours. Aberdeen, Berwick. So if the Broch wanted its share, it needed a safe landing place for shipping. And so it was Alexander Fraser, 7th Laird of Philorth, inheriting the town and the surroundings in 1513, which would begin the process of establishing the harbour. His first attempt is thought to be in the sheltered bay of Broadsea around 1534, but that was little success, didn't get off a wheel at all. So in 1575, a new pier was built in the Black Sands area, roundabout Kinnaird Head at the northern end of the Fraserburgh Bay. And he laid the first stone himself. Its location is about the same spot as the modern North Pier, and this was the beginning. A century passed, very little had changed. Alexander Garden of Troop, he wrote in 1683 of the town's artificial harbour, and he commented that it is the best on this part of the coast, being able to receive 10 feet at neap tide. For the size of the port, it was surprisingly busy. It was a trading port with strong links to Holland and the Baltics, trading corn and other rich produce from the fertile lands of Buchan. Fishing had yet to become the staple in Fraserburgh. It was mostly confined to the small fishing boats of Broadsea, but things would quickly change. The small trading fleet grew. Local ships would sail across the North Sea to Norway, Sweden, Holland, and England with grain in exchange for wood, oars, and a variety of luxury goods. But at the beginning of the 18th century, the population had grown to near 800 people. The old pier, which had survived and served well for nearly 2 centuries, was struggling to cope. It was finally decided it was time to expand. As early as 1761, the widening of the harbour mouth was put out to tender. Great engineers such as John Rennie would play their part in the expansion and deepening of the harbour, with the great expectation of larger and larger trading ships. However, change was quickly coming. Word had spread of the enormous success of Wick as a fishing port, and this persuaded Fraserburgh that serious money could be made from fishing. The wars in Europe were over. British farming was starting to expand, but there would be a huge market for herring. Britain had defeated France and proved itself as the only great world power. Her empire was free to grow. British producers, the Fraserburgh fish curers included, could enjoy the benefits of a captive market. Fishing in the first year was slow. The fleet really wasn't up to the task. 5,519 barrels were sent out by the curers, mainly to Ireland and to feed slaves in the Caribbean. However, the small fleet of open boats soon grew in number, and by 1830, over 200 fished from the town during the season. which lasted from about June to September. The local fishers could depend on landing around 132,000 hundredweight of herring, 10 times the 1815 catch. The harbour, as it was then, was being questioned for its safety. A few close calls in previous storms and the lack of space for the increasing fleets led to a new expansion, and by 1856 the new works were completed. The new North Pier, as it had been called, was christened the Balaclava Breakwater, in reference to the Crimea War which was raging on at the time. Fraserburgh was delighted with its new harbour and looked forward to the growth of the herring industry. But it was not to come for several years. It was soon noted that herring could not be relied upon year to year. They could all but disappear from inshore waters if the North Sea currents carried the plankton they fed on further out to sea. And the majority of the fleet was still made up of frail, open-topped or half-decked boats, far too unsafe to chase fish out into the open sea. But this was soon to change as well. In 1861, the Fraserburgh fleet numbered only 175, which was regarded as a very poor show. However, by 1870, the fishing was back on track. Nearly 560 boats were attracted to the harbour for the duration of the season, growing again and again until in 1875 there were 740 ships sailing out of the Broch. Again, further expansions were required, and so the harbour grew, again and again and again. The ensuing years saw this port develop quickly into the top herring station in the country. A fishing fleet of 844 was one of the largest numbers of sailing boats to prosecute the herring fishing back in 1879. That year's catch amounted to 87,526 crans. A cran was the unit of measure of landed, uncleaned herring, used from at least as early as the 18th century. In 1852, it was defined to be the equivalent of one standard box, 37.5 imperial gallons, or typically about 1,200 fish, dependent on the size of them. The cran was usually hoisted in woven baskets, or in the more established ports as wooden boxes. A quarter cran measures would also be handled by the fisherwives selling fish. Come 1880, with 100 fewer boats, Fraserburgh landed 188,000 cran. Prosperity like this brought the attention of the McConaughey brothers, who in 1883 founded their herring canning factory. One of the top catches in the old days of the herring boom was 320,000 cran in 1907 by 500 vessels. The following season, fishing caught as much to produce 387,000 barrels of cured herring, most of which was exported to the Baltics. The harbour was booming. You could seldom see the water. The harbour was carpeted from end to end in mast and sail and wooden rudder. Back in 1815, it was a little boat called a scaffy which dominated. The small scaffies were little more than 20 feet in length, with a 12-foot beam, and the cost £6. They were timber-built, with what is termed a raked stern and a curved bow, and by 1835 they measured between 24 and 26 feet, with a 14-foot beam, and cost £60. These were undecked boats, very basic. There was no shelter for the crew, the men had to sleep exposed to the elements, a fire was kindled amongst the ballast stones to cook their food, and this continued until the late 1850s, when the herring boats were decked for the very first time. The life was extremely difficult at sea in those days. A day a shot in nets keeled up in a basket on the deck, then hauling them back in full of fish for hours and hours and hours. You had to be strong, you had to be fit, and if you wasn't, after a few weeks at the sea, you would be. Although they only ventured a few miles offshore, they hugged the coastline. Their boats were powered by either sail or oar, dependent on the wind. The little craft were totally unfit for storms or heavy seas, and if they saw such conditions brewing, they would not go out. But when caught in bad weather, the results were often catastrophic. In 1843, storms raged up and down the coast, causing wreckage and great loss of life. Such grief through deaths at sea gave purpose to decking the boats, because sometimes entire fleets of these hollow shell-structured ships were swamped by the cruel seas and lost. Entire communities mourned the terrible losses of life and their livelihood. The Fyfie followed the Scafie and was an extremely good fishing craft which proved herself over many years. She was a first-class seaworthy boat, having length of keel not much shorter than her overall length from bow to stern. Her design was a vertical bow with a light rake at the stern, and her wide beam gave her good hold of the water and thus a good boat at sea. Like the Fyfie, the Zulu too was a first-class vessel, but her shape gave her more speed. The first boat was built during the Zulu War in 1879 in Stevens Yard in Banff, and the mainsail weighed approximately half a ton, with a canvas covering 425 yards. The raising and lowering of masts, sails, and drawing in knots by hand was back-breaking labour. Without the wind, these ships were motionless, but with whispers of a breeze, a good skipper would send his boat on course. In calm weather and without the right condition, there was no choice but to stay in port or out at sea. And a wifey recalled seeing the entire Fraserburgh fleet laden with fish, not far off the harbour, but unable to enter because there was no power to do so. With the advent of steam at sea, a steam tug towed out the fleet in larger ports, and soon steam drifters were to take over. By 1910, the heyday of sail had come to an end, and by 1914 there were entire fleets powered by steam. And a few years before the First World War also heralded in the motor engine, and gradually these older class of sailboat became fitted with diesel motors. Those who still held on to the sailing class of boat, they would race their new rivals, and given the right conditions, neither the motor or steam could outrun the sail. However, her days were numbered, and eventually the sight of sail became a rare thing indeed. There is an interesting story which can be added here. An old northeast boat builder, long retired from his trade, swiftly made a small model ship and entered it in a London model yacht race. It was not believed by the professionals that this odd little craft had the slightest chance of a prize. However, when it actually won the race by quite a margin, he was surrounded by a team of enthusiasts who asked what on earth his entry was, and he replied, "That's a Scottish fishing boat." The steam drifters first arrived in 1880. The first steam drifter was built at Leith, and 2 years later, 7 of these Scottish-made boats were proving their worth at the herring fishing. The fleets only continued to expand from there. These boats measured from 80 to 90 feet in length, and although a few were even longer, they could travel from between 9 to 11 knots, and one of these drifters, fitted with all the gear, cost about £3,000 in 1914, which was a very expensive fishing vessel. So due to this high cost, few, if any, fishermen could own one outright, and so there were usually several shareholders in each boat. The crew comprised 12 men, skipper, driver, stoker, and 9 deckhands. Those who still owned Fyfies and Zulus, they were finding it hard to keep up with these magnificent rivals, but they too were soon fitted out with motor engines. These were either Kelvin or Gardner, and proved a successful change from sail power to self-propulsion, and many of these fine sailing class of vessel actually outlived their rivals in steam. The industry was at its height, The Broch was booming. The curing yards were stapped. The coopers made the herring barrels from wood imported from Sweden. Thousands of coopers were employed in the making of barrels throughout the winter and the spring months in the northeast of Scotland. In fact, production of barrel was the chief industry in the fishing towns through those prosperous years. Building up a barrel by hand, like it was done in the old days, was quite a hard job. The cooper had to dress his staves so that he would get a tight fit to seal the barrel properly in order to allow the pickle to cure the herring. The shaping of the barrel with the use of fire and hoops was a very skillful art, and it was extremely hard and difficult job. During the height of the herring fishing, coopers were extremely busy sealing barrels after the packers had completed their task. But who were these packers? Enter the gutting Quines. Women, lassies, girls, Quines. The gutting Quines were formed into crews of 3, 2 gutters and 1 packer. Some started at the curing stations from as early as 13, although 15 was the average age. They worked long hours. Depending on the size of the catch, they could be working well into the early hours, and sometimes for days on end. They were often taught their trade by their mothers, who ensured their daughters carried on the family line of work. The work, though, was very hard on the hands because of the salt that was used for the pickle. This gave them much trouble. Frequently, the girl's skin would become allergic to the salt and crack, causing a great deal of discomfort. They were adept at cleaning herring with short but razor-sharp knives, kint as a fuddle, and with a single twist of the wrist, each fish was gutted separately at incredible speed. In order to protect the fingers and thumb of the left hand which held the fish being gutted, cloth was wrapped around in strips around each finger like a bandage, for fear of being cut by the knife in the right hand. The girls worked at huge troughs, known better as farlands. The herring was supplied from the boats by horse and cart, and then loaded into these large wooden buckets and emptied by labourers into the farlands. The gutters lifted the fish out singly, and as the knife pierced the flesh, the guts dropped into wooden bins, and the herring, according to size, were chucked into graded bins. The Quines kint automatically by the weight, without even looking as to what the grade of the fish was. They were either matties, matfuls, fulls, large fulls, and spints. The fishing officers kept a close eye on the size of the fish landed, and this was done regularly. Once the work was done, and the herring gutted, the girls usually waited for the next fresh arrival. They would spend time chatting and singing. Singing played an important role in their working life, and made their work a little lighter. Most of their free time was put to practical use, and that was mainly knitting woolen clothing. Fisher wifeys were famous for their knitting. For a wifey to sit hand idle was a crime, and they would knit while walking, visiting friends, and went on a break in the herring yards. When the men left for the fishing season, they took sea kists packed with hand-knitted garments, 5 or 6 each. Gansies were knitted in unoiled, soft, round, dark blue 6 or 5 ply wool on size 14 needles to make a firm, close fabric that was almost wind and waterproof. Some traditions state that a drowned man could be identified by the pattern on his gansie. The patterns had names such as herringbone, anchor and flag, and could be varied or combined according to taste. Women moving from port to port copied each other's designs and could even copy a pattern seen being worn by a stranger in the street. The herring fishers followed the shoals of herring throughout the coastline. The curers went too. These gutting Quines were accustomed to travelling long distances in pursuit of the silver darlings, and this led them throughout Scotland, to Shetland, Northern Ireland, England. It was a country-wide trade. The fleets followed the fish, and the towns benefited greatly from the profits. The Broch was booming. A healthy economy in the northeast depended almost entirely on the success of the fishing industry. The industry had pulled itself out of many disastrous years with little harvested from the sea, but none were more ruinous than those of impending war, or more calamitous than the dark days of it. Besides the massive loss of life that no atonement could ever compensate for, many excellent fishermen with their expert skills were lost to the industry, a loss which would take years to replace. Coastal communities were always badly hit when war broke out. Disaster struck with the sound knell of the First World War. Curers lost money, and many lost everything they had because of the herring shipped to both Russia and Germany. Most of them never recovered and went bankrupt. Finally, the market was lost to these countries, a loss that was to strangle the industry. A man from the Admiralty arrived in 1914 to choose vessels for service, and there followed a further collapse in the industry. As its fleets were depleted, the drifters went on patrol to protect our coasts, or sailed far and wide as mine-sweeping vessels. Every town, every village and hamlet had their casualties, and every fisher family felt the costs. The Alwyn of Port Soy was reported sunk by a torpedo, and the Betsy Sim from Rosarty never returned. Macduff had a fleet of 40 steam drifters, but few were left to fish when the war ended. A catastrophic blow was dealt to the Peterhead fishing fleet just off Shetland in midsummer 1915. A U-boat sighted the boats fishing near the Skerries and sank 11 Peterhead craft. The rest of that season saw the smallest fishing fleet ever being protected by the Royal Navy. With the outbreak of the Second World War, local shipyards were busy making vessels for the Ministry of Defence. In Fraserburgh, 97 minesweepers were built. The Forbes of Sanhaven shipyard also helped stock up the naval supplies of minesweepers during this wartime. Steam drifters again were utilised for the war effort. From a figure of 17,000 Scottish fishermen at the beginning of World War II, 8,000 of them became part of the naval war machine, while another 2,000 were involved in various services to the country. What fishing fleet there was had only boys and elderly men serving in it, and enemy attack on those poor, ill-equipped boats occurred frequently. As in the First War, the fishing was severely hit, but this time the enemy came closer. Harbour areas were bombed and often came under machine gun fire, and of course there were casualties. A kippering kiln in the Broch was hit without loss of life, but McConaughey's fish factory had 5 killed and 101 injured during an attack. The industry suffered another great loss through the war, and its war-torn fleets were in an unhealthy state. Truly the great boom years were over. The herring trade died for a long while. But of course, anyone who has ever visited Fraserburgh will know that its harbour managed to survive. The slow crippling of the herring industry was very damaging, but not fatal, although many other Scottish fishing ports were not so lucky. Walk around today and you'll see one of the busiest and most up-to-date fishing centres in the country. A successful white fishing port, as well as the largest shellfish port in Europe. There is much to celebrate about the Broch today, but this has been but a slither of the real history out there. The stories of the expansions and deepening of the harbour, of the accidents, the political turmoil, and a determination to succeed. The shipbuilders' legacies of beautiful crafted Fraserburgh-built craft. Fraserburgh at war, the bombings, a country plunged into darkness for fear of their lives, a samurai, an Italian, and perhaps a bright future. Never take for granted what you have, Fraserburgh. I've had the pleasure of taking over 500 people from all over the world through your town this year, each fascinated by its history. charmed by its beauty and simply awestruck by what those simple scuffy boats have managed to evolve into. I'm always happy to see the Christina S in port when I'm coming through, because I get to use the line that I told you they were like cruise boats, and they gasp. But yes, the Fraserburgh area is a haven. It's a haven for nature, a haven for community, and it should never be taken for granted. Until next time, I'll maybe catch you in episode 3.